Tobias Ellwood, hello. How's it going?
Hi. Nice to see you.
You too. Um, Tobias, you've described the West's relationship with China as a new Cold War. Why?
Well, that's a big statement. If anybody can remember the last Cold War, and probably the audience is too young to remember it, but it was a big squabble between two gigantic superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And what we're seeing now is a bipolar world developing, and that concerns me. It's all to do with China, as you mentioned. We hoped that China would mature into this global Western responsible citizen, be more like us, if you like, open up its trade. It manufactures more stuff than anywhere else in the world. And we hoped that by economic ties, it would improve its democracy, its human rights, it would open up and be part of the Western family. And what we're seeing now is that actually isn't really happening. And if ever there was a spotlight, unfortunately, placed on China, is probably to do with the pandemic, really, as to the outbreak of what happened there. The fact that they try to close the doors, deny that it even started in the first place, actually have a pop at the doctor who dared to stand up and say, hang on, something's going on here. And this has allowed, the world really to look at China and say, my goodness, okay, we really wanted you to grow into something different. You're not doing that. Not only that, you're actually providing a interpretation of the international world order which challenges the way we do business. So the way they trade, what they're doing in the South China Sea, for example, and indeed their lack of democracy, their lack of transparency, all very concerning indeed.
I'm glad you raised the South China Sea. I wanted to discuss with you along which lines you see this conflict playing out, because obviously people, the Cold War, if you like, proxy conflicts, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. What sort of areas do you see being the key contests in this relationship with China?
Well, the last Cold War was all about a build-up of a lot of military might, either side of the Iron Curtain, military weapons, armaments, nuclear warheads, all this sort of stuff. In the same way that the character of conflict changes, so is the nature of Cold Wars too. This will be very, very different. It'll be firstly fought upon some of the areas that I've just spoken about China putting pressure on countries to say, right, if you've got Huawei and use our technology, you're not allowed to use the stuff in the West. If we've given you big loans to build infrastructure things, we don't want you doing business with the West. So that's one approach of pressurizing them. And then the second one is a little bit more clandestine, a little bit more sort of James Bond, if you like, which is bypassing military engagement, because no longer are you going to get the military attack on the United States or even the United States attacking China. It's all going to be rather clever now. Our complete reliance, the dominance of the internet now means that we are very, very vulnerable indeed. Everything we do, everything we say, how we communicate, how we go about our business and our work, if that's interrupted at all, it affects our economy, it affects our lives. And it's a lot easier to do that with a laptop and a lot of Red Bull than it is, let's say, with getting military bombs and doing things the old-fashioned way.
It seems extraordinary now that the UK was considering inserting Huawei into the centre of our mobile data digital infrastructure in providing the 5G network. I know the Johnson government has now moved away from that, but I mean that would indicate that the UK is essentially asleep at the wheel when it comes to the threat posed by China.
Well, let's not forget why China is able to offer this stuff. I mean, they have grown incredibly over the last 10 to 15 years. Everything gets made in China. It was originally all the cheap stuff, all the toys and bits and pieces. Then they started advancing and making all the tech stuff as well. And the reason why it's cheaper is because they don't pay their workers so much. So if you've got a choice of spending billions and billions using Western capabilities or less than billions and billions using China, which way are you going to go? But ultimately, it's a political question. And you touched on it yourself. The consequences of us stepping back from Huawei have actually seen China turn around and say, right, we're going to stop broadcasting the Premier League football in China. Now, if that's the case, this isn't just a commercial company. This clearly is an extension of the Chinese state utilizing it as a tool. So I'm pleased that we got out now. Imagine if we'd have taken this decision, had Huawei embedded into our national critical infrastructure, and then things go a little bit sour with China, they could have easily done some playing around to affect our telecoms with huge consequences to our economy and our way of life.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how this conflict is playing out in terms of soft power, where the Premier League is part and parcel of the conflict. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? But I think often we're talking, there's this soft power element to it, but when it comes to cyber warfare and cyber attacks, that can have very material, real world consequences, can't it? If you, for instance, targeting the national grid or water supplies, utilities, This cyber threat, it is grounded in reality, isn't it? It's not just, damaging digital infrastructure.
Well, we see it all the time playing out with attacks on the NHS, on Parliament and so on. We've not even begun to feel the sheer strength of what a proper cyber attack would be. And the more we advance with this telecoms, 5G, your children, if you have any, I don't know, but they will not need a driving license. Why? Because they'll take their phone, press an app, and an automated car will turn up, not requiring them to drive. They just jump in it, takes them to where they want to go, and then they hop out again, okay? So you don't need to actually own a car anymore. But the only way that can work is by 5G having the capability of communicating with that car all the time. And if you're reliant on a telecoms company that could possibly play around with the switches, you can see what a dangerous world that might be. But even today, you think about our vulnerability of our satellites, GPS, for example. Every time you go into Costa Cafe or any bar and buy a drink, you're using 3 satellites. When you use your debit card, tap on the machine. Why? Because it's linked to the internet. That GPS coordination is not so much the location, it's the time signature that says this financial contract took place at this time because of the atomic clocks that are in the satellites. Now, you play around with those satellites, and goodness me, how our world, imagine what it feels like when you lose your mobile phone, that sense of nakedness and, my goodness, I don't know what to do. Imagine if that was right across the piece. Not only your phone, your computers, nothing then worked. We'd be knocked back to the 1950s, and that would be hugely problematic, but beneficial to anybody that's watching this from afar, not affected by that blackout.
Beyond the infrastructure as well, there is the enormous power in data, isn't there? And if, for example, being involved in a national 5G network, the level, the depth of what you're able to collect and how much of an advantage that can be for a potential adversary, it's quite shocking, really, when you get down to it. And we would entrust that to the Chinese government.
Well, it's the new prize. It's the new terrain. It used to be that you'd stick a flag on somewhere. I own this territory. That's mine. And the people and everything comes with it. No longer. That's not as important as actually owning the data itself. So if you go around the world offering telecoms deals to countries to provide them, next to nothing, Ethiopia is just looking for a new contract in telecoms mobile. And guess what? Huawei has promised to undercut, I understand, any Western country to do that. Now, of course, you have that data. You can then understand who's saying what to who. And let's not forget that one of the reasons why China is able to actually keep control of its own people is because all telecoms companies in China have to allow access to their intelligence agencies of these very same companies. And that's a place we don't want to go to.
Yes, I'm glad you raised Ethiopia, because I wanted to ask you about where you see China's sort of new sphere of influence being, if you like. And the African continent is somewhere where traditionally in the West, we don't pay a great deal of attention to. And yet it is the home of these natural resources, coltan, silicon, vital things in our infrastructure. I mean, go on, tell me, where is it that you see the sphere of influence of China being?
You're absolutely right. And it's an indication of perhaps how relaxed we've become in nurturing these relationships. The Commonwealth was supposed to be, our big friends across the world. These very same Commonwealth nations are now getting to so in debt with China. A good example is Sri Lanka. It asked China to build a naval port, big port. And then it turned out that the terms and conditions that China had pressurized Sri Lanka to utilize, they couldn't afford. That port has now been handed over to the Chinese Navy. So the Chinese Navy have a new port in Sri Lanka. And that is being repeated right across the board. There are dozens and dozens of countries across the world that are now either indebted to China to the point whereby they're tied into long-term Chinese thinking, or enough to remove that country from ever criticizing China. So Italy, for example, has now joined this what's called the One Belt, One Road program. They are massively indebted to the tune of billions to China. Can you see them complaining about actions in the South China Sea, or indeed what happened in Hong Kong? They will not dare touch that subject because they don't upset their masters. The port of Piraeus that people might be familiar with, the big port in near Athens, takes you to all the islands. It's now being purchased. It's now the shares are owned by China. They're very clever at providing soft power tentacles into either Western countries or indeed into the developing countries to silence any noise they might make to complain about China's behavior.
So it's interesting because I think you could come back on that sort of line of argument and say, in the previous unipolar moment that the world experienced, the America by proxy, whether it was through the IMF or other international organizations like that, using structural adjustment plans to sort of impose a neoliberal order on countries, whether it was for taking loans, state support, forcing them into an economic agenda in a similar way, and then look at the proliferation of US military bases across the world, and someone could say, hang on a minute, China is just behaving in the same way that the United States has for the last 20 years. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Well, the difference is that if any country asked the United States to leave, they would be obliged to leave. And it's probably been passed by legislation to allow that through. And it could be the United States by their own volition would want to step back. And you're right, this is what superpowers do. But ultimately, at least with the United States, they share our values and our standards. And there might be aspects of what they do that we don't like. But in general, their outlook is very, very similar to ours, which is why we have the closest relationships to any other nation in the world. What we're seeing with China is they're pursuing a very different track. It's a one single party that's in power here. They like the idea of an autocratic state, and they'll promote that wherever they want to go. So many of the countries that they sell their products to, their services to, their way of life to, are actually to other potential dictators that are quite happy to have more of an authoritarian control over that particular state. So in many cases in Africa, where we have, long leaders that have been there for many, many years, they're quite keen to lean towards that. And that's the concern I have, is the bipolarity of this, that countries are forced one way or another. And that, I think, is the fundamental aspect of this that we must look at. Because with the rise of China, we've also seen the demise of what it is to be part of the West. You touched on the IMF, the World Bank, WTO. These are great organizations, but we've not done enough to update them in this very modern context that we're speaking about. So consequently, China's reinterpreting the rules, offering something different to its own advantage. And the absence of international leadership, not least, dare I say it, from the United States, means that China is able to get away with it. They're not challenged in the South China Sea in the same way that Russia is not challenged in Syria. And their debt trap diplomacy, as it's called, of luring countries into ever further debt on terms they can't afford, we've not been challenging. So the West must come together and be far stronger than we currently are.
How much of this do you see the decline of the West as a long-term trend? I mean, expedited, presumably, in your view, under the current presidency, but how much of a long-term trend do you think this is?
I think you're absolutely right to point to that. It's not just come overnight. I think it's been illustrated even further because of the COVID-19, countries retreating further from global exposure. You want to become more independent. You don't want to have supply chains that, reach across to Asia now. You want to be self-sufficient. But ultimately, it does mean that the Western countries themselves have forgotten what we stand for. What are we willing to defend? What are we willing to come together and believe in? And that's to China and indeed to some extent Russia's benefit as well. We didn't stand up to Russia in eastern Ukraine or the Crimea or indeed in Syria as well. And we've moved from, in the last Cold War, if Russia was out of line and did something, there would be retaliation. There's no doubt about it. America would punish. Today, we've gone to denial. The only way that we can stop China doing anything is to deny them in the first place. So stop them. We get there first. China will respect that because they don't war anybody more than anybody else. But you leave a vacuum, China will exploit it militarily, economically, or technologically as well.
Yes, the similar story to Syria, I suppose. Just sort of final topic I'd like to cover with you, Tobias, is the British media, the way they've been reporting and looking into this, the sort of the battle over Huawei and more broadly our relationship with China, is in the context of a conservative backbench, call it rebellion, but a gentle simmering, if you like, of mistrust, tension. And I wondered, in your view, how widespread that is, how widely felt it is, if it's even there at all. Is there that sort of unease in the Conservative backbenches around this issue in the way that it's being reported?
I don't think it's just unease in the backbenches. I think it's an unease right across the board. We're not able to quite put our finger on it yet, but we're concerned about what we see of what China is all about. Like I mentioned before, they're not maturing into this stakeholder that we'd hoped they'd be. We turned a blind eye to many of the faux pas, many of the irregularities that we were concerned about with China. The fact that there is no democracy, there are human rights issues there, no understanding of the rule of law. They've become a superpower, but they don't want the responsibilities that come with that in upholding our international standards and values. And the consequence of that, we saw David Cameron, George Osborne, if you recall, a number of years ago, going across to China saying this is the golden era of opportunity. We all lined up to do business with China because they were the darling of the West. Now, my question is, when does the penny drop? Is it the fall of Taiwan that we finally realize that China absolutely is in competition to the West, not in alignment, in strategic competition to what we believe in? And that's a difficult 180-degree turn for any government to make. And I think at the moment, we've just prodded a little bit this dragon, if you like. We stood up to them because of their actions in Hong Kong. But we need, in my view, a full foreign policy reset. We mustn't stop here, but we can't do this alone. We've got to work with our allies, and not least the United States. And we may have to wait till after the next presidential election for that to happen.
Yeah, I wonder how much David Cameron will regret going for that pint with President Xi. I think it was in a pub in Chipping Norton or something, wasn't it? Just finally, sorry, Tobias. One of the other sort of issues that backbenchers have been voicing their concern about is the increasing centralization of power in the executive. The sort of, I wouldn't call it, well, totalitarian, not literally, but, the individuals in Downing Street wielding a lot of power. And recently we're seeing that Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's favourite advisor, chief advisor, has been given this security clearance. He's visiting top secret security sites, sensitive sites. And I wondered if that's given you cause for concern.
Interesting way you put things. I want to see the most talented people advance and participate in government itself. My default position is to support this government. But I am with you in the concern in making sure that the legislative, so the parliament itself, is utilised in its best capacity. The fact that we have oversight of the executive, of government itself, actually helps raise government's game rather than actually doing things on the quiet. They have to answer to us. They have to rethink things through. That's a good thing. And it's what makes us an exemplar of good governance across the world. People come and look at us as our structures, as to how we operate. With regards to Dominic Cummings and his involvement with the integrated review or the study of our defence posture and so forth, that is allowed. That's part of the system. But ultimately, he must receive the same scrutiny as ministers, as military leaders, and indeed other civil servants. So, in fact, I've written to him to invite him in front of my committee so I can ask the very questions that you're actually putting to me now.
Well, best of luck with that, Tobias. As I recall, the last time he was summoned to a select committee, he did not turn up. But thank you so much for your time, Tobias Ellwood. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.